I want to bring in our Major Garrett, who's actually at the White House there. Major, talk about stagecraft. A lot of criticism the president did get about this Asia trip. I want to ask you a little bit more about the policy there from this standpoint. Do we know why he chose to come out?
Well, first of all, let's just mark this down as a moment of gullibility for all the reporters who cover the White House. Because this was billed as a major announcement. It was not. It was a recitation of the things the president said consistently on the trip to Asia, which I and my colleague Margaret Brennan accompanied the president on and dutifully reported each and every day's development. But the president came back to the United States feeling that he simply did not get enough credit for what he thought, as he said in his opening line, was a historic trip to Asia. Well, that's his perception, and the president is certainly capable of making his own argument. But that's what he did. There was no news at all, not one scintilla of news in this so-called major announcement. The president knew that, most of his advisors knew that, and sort of led us to believe that that was in large measure what the president was going to do on this day upon returning from the 12-day trip to Asia. Give a speech sort of regurgitating all the things that he thought went well. And there are a couple of things worth highlighting. China is doing more by any historical measure against North Korea than it ever has before. That is a fact. And one of the precipitating factors behind that change in behavior is the president's private aggression and pressing of President Xi Jinping of China to do more, and his public utterances on Twitter that are by turns aggressive in terms of threatening military action and also just sort of volatile and unpredictable. And they kind of scare everybody in the region about what are Donald Trump's actual intentions as commander-in-chief. The Chinese have reacted to this and done more to press this issue with the North Koreans. The Japanese and South Koreans have also become a bit closer, though not 100% aligned, on the issue of North Korea. And within the region, there is more harmony and more condemnation of North Korea than there had been before. That's a fact, and that's worth contrasting with the behavior that existed before Donald Trump became president of the United States. And on trade, the president's rhetoric is decidedly different. He takes this America First attitude straight to these nations. There are no real changes in those nations' trade posture with the United States, but they may come in the future. What's also worth pointing out, when the president talks about trade in Asia, by pulling the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was going to be a 13-nation alignment of most of the Asian nations, a few on the Western Hemisphere, but not China, the entire theory behind that was to have an economic bloc that would be a counterweight to China and establish generalized and acceptable rules of trade throughout that region, forcing China over time to live under those rules if it wanted to deal with any of those members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. By pulling the United States out of that, the other nations are now pursuing their own deal, excluding the United States and excluding China. So the two biggest trading and economic nations in this region, the United States and China, may find themselves on the outside looking in to all future trade agreements. Whether or not that, on balance, helps U.S. manufacturing, helps American workers, we don't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it is a true fact when you talk to foreign ministers and economic ministers in Asia, the United States, being outside of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, forces those nations to collaborate with each other as trying to be that counterweight to China, which they all believe they desperately need to be.
Many people wondering, fair and reciprocal trade, if these countries are banding together, what's this going to mean for us? I do want to go on to something slightly superficial. Marco Rubio has weighed in, and I've got to bring you this tweet. He says, similar, but needs work on his form. Has to be done in one single motion, and eyes should never leave the camera, but not bad for his first time, referring obviously to the drink of water he took from the bottled water.
Let me make an observation about this. If you notice, the president was in the diplomatic room. It's a pretty small space here in the White House compound. There was no audience there. There were only reporters, still photographers, videographers, and the print journalists. And yet the president, I'm sure you noticed, anyone in our audience who was listening, at times he was practically shouting this speech.
Yeah.
There was this sort of physicality and emphasis that I believe is consistent with his own psychological interpretation. He wants a lot of credit for this. He thinks he did a phenomenal job. Donald Trump always thinks he does a phenomenal job, but he particularly does on this trip because he believes he was very active, did many events, did many meetings, had lots of conversations, was as energetic as any recent American president has, and he wants credit for that. He wants people to give him credit for being this very super energized, indefatigable defender of America first in Asia.
Speaking of
and he
credit,
doesn't think he's getting it. He doesn't think he's getting it.
Speaking
of
credit,
giving this speech with that emphasis, I think, made him far thirstier than he ever expected he would be, because he was practically screaming it.
Yeah. Major, speaking of credit, you know, he did tweet out earlier that he wanted some credit from the UCLA basketball team for getting them out. He said he intervened and spoke to the Chinese president. Have you heard anything from the White House? Is he happy that he got that? The players came out and congratulated him.
I haven't, but I'm sure they are. Yeah. And that is consistent with what needed to be done, because this event occurred while the president was there, and he did bring it up with President Xi. And of course, President Xi knew he would bring it up, and everyone knew that it was going to be resolved. The Chinese government was never going to sentence for 10 years 3 basketball players from the University of California, Los Angeles. That was never going to happen. But it became an unnecessary distraction, number one, and diplomatic lever, because things had to be asked for. The United States had to sort of kind of come begging on this one and say, look, they did something wrong, they violated your laws. We are in no position to do anything but more or less beg you for leniency and to resolve this sooner rather than later. I guarantee you the Chinese heard all of that. Absolutely. And if not in the moment, at some point in the future, will seek their own reciprocity.
Major Garrett, Major, welcome home. I know you and the gang over there at the White House have had a long couple of weeks, so we're going to let you go. Thank you for joining us,
And I
Major.
thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely.